Hey there, welcome to this episode of The Cutting Room Floor. I know it's been a little while since I've recorded one of these videos, and that's really a couple reasons. Mainly just time. I haven't had I've had some other things going on, and so I've not had really the time to put into recording these videos for the last little while. But the other thing is I always when I record these videos, I really want to make sure that the content is actually really interesting and that I'm not just kind of, looking for something just for the sake of recording a segment. But this week when I was working on the message from James chapter 4, 11 and 12, the idea in that text, of course, has to do with judging and slandering other people. And this was something I at one point was going to include in the message, but it really was one of these things where the message was just getting too long, and so I literally had to cut this part out. But I still thought it's an interesting topic because in our current culture, in our day and age, the like one of the worst sins that a person can commit against another person is to judge that person. And so we hear it often said that nobody should judge people. Don't judge, and that just sort of means take a live and let live approach. And on one level that sounds all well and good, and it usually means that you're not to single out the sins or the wrongdoing of another person. You're really just meant, if that's not how you do things, that's fine, but don't impose your views and don't impose your morals and your values and your beliefs on another person. Because judging is really, it's one of the cardinal sins that you can commit. But the problem with that, and the difficulty that you run up against very quickly, is that you can't escape judging people. Like, whether whether you're a religious person or whether you're irreligious, we all have this tendency to judge people. And the thing about it is that we're actually really terrible at it. So if you are a person that leans like religiously, politically, socially on the right, those are oftentimes, it's assumed that those are the people who are most guilty of judging. In other words, when people think about who are the most judgmental folks, a lot of times what first comes to mind are the people who are, strict religious and, Bible believing, and they just want to impose reality. And so what they typically, and there may be some truth to that. In other words, it's probably true that, it is true that religious people indeed can be very judgy. They can point out sins of other people, and they can do it at times in a way that's very ungracious and very uncharitable and unkind. Um, Typically what we see, it's not exclusively, but typically what you'll see is for people who lean right, and by leaning right I mean like socially, politically, you know theologically or religiously. They tend to focus on speaking against like personal sins. So people who lean to the right tend to single out like things like abortion or sexual immorality, and they are very quick to identify and name those things as being morally wrong. The problem is, or the danger is, that people who lean right uh, can easily ignore systemic sins. They can overlook sins of racism. They can overlook the economic injustice and other such sins that tend to affect broader culture. And so, what can happen is that people who are on the right can indeed become judgmental, and they can be, and they focus more on individual and personal sins while ignoring or downplaying or minimizing more, let's call them systemic types of sins. And this is, of course, where people who are on the left get really riled up and really amped up. They are really, you know, they object very strongly to people who judge personal individual actions like abortion. That's why they say, well, abortion is a woman's choice, and it's for nobody else to speak against that except for the person who is involved. And so people who are on the left tend to get very offended or indignant about people who are on the right, and that hence the label, you're just judging me, and you have no right to judge me. The problem there is that people who are on the left tend to they tend to be very outspoken about systemic sins. They speak against things like racism or sex trafficking or social injustice, but all the while you end up you sort of take the approach that, well, personal sins are just personal, they're individual, they're your own choice. And in the process, people who are on the left can actually become very judgmental. They can become very harsh towards others, towards the sins of other people. And so and they can be very intolerant of people who violate the sins that they care about. In other words, if you're on the left, you'll look at a person who maybe downplays the presence of racism or social injustice or economic injustice, and you'll look at people who downplay those or ignore those, and you can become very harsh and very critical and very, we sometimes talk about cancel culture, which is exactly that. Now, my point in saying all of that is not to so much make a case for or against any of these sins that I've named, but just to highlight how people who are on the left and on the right, basically all people, can easily fall into this trap of becoming very, very judgmental. And that's in when that happens, that's exactly what James is warning about. You as an individual have decided which of God's laws apply and which ones don't. If you're on the right, you decide that the laws about sexual immorality and abortion and things, that you decide those laws matter, but the other ones don't matter as much. And if you're on the left, you decide that the laws about economic injustice matter and the other laws don't. So we all judge, and James warns us about this, and that's one of the reasons. And of course, this brings us to the message. That's one of the reasons that James says there's only one judge. See, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian writer who spent 9 years, I think, in a Russian gulag, he was contemplating the nature of evil and sin, and of course he had been imprisoned because he was a dissident and he'd criticized the Russian regime. And he was then imprisoned for that. And of course, while he's in the gulag, it was easy for him to point the finger at and judge the people in power and to say they're the ones who are wrong and I'm innocent. But what he came to realize, and he wrote this, I can't quote it exactly, but he says something like, the line between good and evil does not run through class or race or social structure, but it cuts through every human heart. In other words, what Solzhenitsyn was getting at is that that when it comes to judging, we all fall short of the bar. Maybe we do it in different ways, but we all fall short. And ultimately, there's only one judge who is perfectly righteous and just. And so we all have to see ourselves in relation, not to in relation to other people, but ultimately we have to see ourselves in relation to God. And that does not take away, as I said in the message, it doesn't take away the importance and the place of properly addressing wrongs in other people, but it completely transforms how we go about that. We actually find that we become more compassionate, we become more sensitive to people, we see them as codependents and people who struggle with the very same sins, because at the end of the day, we all fall short of the standard of perfect righteousness, and ultimately we all need someone who can stand up to that bar of justice in our place. Thanks for watching this episode of The Cutting Room Floor, and we'll see you next time.